Okay. Okay, so welcome all of you to this session on regional disparities, internal geography and external trade. And we have the pleasure to hear the first paper being presented this afternoon is by Brian Hearn and Anthony Venables. And Anthony is presenting. So the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Marco. Yeah, obviously a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the organisers of the conference for putting this together. This is certainly one of the grander rooms in which I've ever spoken, so it definitely merits standing up in homage to the surroundings. Okay, this is obviously a paper with Brian, who knows a lot about Italian economic history, unlike me, who still knows very little, even after working on it for some months on this project. But it's been really fascinating for me. But Brian has carried a huge amount of the work in doing this. So the question that we want to address, I've stated there in very, very general terms. Why has the North had an advantage, in some sense, that we'll pin down over the South, that's persisted for so long, persisted for 150 years. And obviously the answer we're going to give is in terms of the rest of the title. The answer we're going to give is in terms of an interaction between internal geography and comparative advantage, external trade and trade policy. We're going to argue that those things interacted in completely different ways in different periods, but to produce a similar reinforcing outcome through 150 years. So it's a little bit of sort of one damn thing after another theory of history. Different sorts of interactions, but all piling in the same way. What I'm going to do is really give you one slide with the overview. So I want to get sort of overarching picture and story over to you straight away. Then 4 or 5 slides laying out some of the facts, probably most of which are known to you anyway, but nevertheless, let's spend some time laying out the facts. A very little bit of theory. And then, of course, I've got the sort of task in persuasion that I have to do, arguing that the facts and the theory come together into a narrative that you may or may not find convincing for the periodization we're going to put on this. So there'll be the narrative and then some conclusions. Okay, the overview. When you think about the location of economic activity within a country, let me assert that it's determined by 3 things. First thing is natural advantage, by which I mean mountains, coasts, rivers, ports, water, climate, all the basic natural endowments. That's one element. Second element is domestic market access. How well placed a location is to reach consumers, but also to access input markets, be they labour or capital or intermediate goods. So there's natural advantage, there's domestic market access, and there's foreign market access. How well located is a region, city, whatever, within the country to be able to reach export markets. And of course, the obverse of that, how vulnerable it is to import competition from outside. So it's foreign market access, but also foreigners' access to your markets. So they're the 3 forces that I think are important in determining the distribution of economic activity within a country. What we're going to argue that each of those was particularly influential, I do use the word dominant, in Italy during different periods. Now, please let's not get too hung up on the periodization, the exact start year, end year. But the argument is going to be running up to around about 1890, it was natural advantage that was the key driver. And of course, that's going to have a lot to do with water and silk and textiles, but perhaps silk in particular. So first period where that's doing things. Second period, 1890 to 1939 or 1950 or whatever, where it's domestic market access that matters relatively more. And the argument there is going to be that there was a closure of the economy going on throughout that period. We'll make that argument, obviously. And as that closure was occurring, so internal trades, the domestic market became more important, clustering stories became more important. So that's the driving force for that period. Then in the third period, the post-war period, and opening up, in particular, of course, opening up to the European, I was going to say Union, European Economic Communities, was opening up to the north. So there, it's foreign market access that is crucial, bearing in mind that's also foreign import competition. So it's foreign market access that was critical. So we want to see the whole period in terms of those three phases. It's, you know, it's nice and neat. You've got three forces, three phases, right? Hangs together. Well, I better try and persuade you of that in a moment. But of course, most countries weren't like that. Yeah, the north of England flourished. Yeah, natural advantage was in the north of England, and then things, you know, happened in the south and whatever. Things moved around. United States, Germany. Yeah, that gives you the disadvantage of rust belts, of declining areas. Italy, I was going to say, has never had that. Someone will disagree immediately. But the point in Italy is it's been, you know, the north favoured each time rather than things moving around. Okay, let me get on from that overview to laying out some of the facts and a little bit of theory, and then the difficult task of trying to persuade you it possibly hangs together. So we obviously started, you know, looking at regional disparities, evolution of you know, a number of regional variables through time. Population, what's the story there? Before answering that question, let me say you're going to see quite a lot of diagrams, pictures, variables, where we rank things. I mean, thinking about Italy, it's the structure of the geography that matters. Unfortunately, Italy is a sort of almost linear country, not quite. So you're going to see a lot of things where distance from Milan is going to be an underlying variable. So obviously here there are regions ranked by distance from Milan. So just looking at that, population shares by region, yeah, obviously went up a lot in Lombardy, Lazio in particular. But were there big population movements north to south over time? Well, I mean, to our surprise, the answer is no. I mean, Lazio gained 6 percentage points, 3 percentage points from the north, and 3 percentage points from the south. What about income? You know, let's just sort of set the stage with these very aggregate things. Yes, I mean, clearly, yeah, total income, so the numbers at the top there are total value added of different regions. So the whole of north of Lazio had an income that was 72% greater than the whole of south, that going to 203% greater, and then down to 116. And peaking round about 1950s, which is something we're going to see a lot as we get to more micro detail in a moment. So there's population, there's income. When we think about these sort of economic geography stuff, we're going to be thinking about market access. So we computed a domestic market access measure. In other words, the income for each region, a weighted sum of income of all other regions, where the weights are inversely related to, well, they're the reciprocal of distance away. Okay, so domestic market access is your market access, sorry, it's the size of your income in the region, and then other regions with declining weights, depending on distance. So if you look at domestic market access, the story for these different time periods is there. So throughout, there's that sort of gradient running north to south. From the earliest periods, the northern regions had the largest, had the best market access. And about twice as big in the north as in the south. But obviously that increased through time, becoming round about 3 times as large. So that gradient, the north-south gradient on market access, was big throughout and became bigger. Another thing I'm going to be showing you a fair bit of is when we have this sort of geographical structure, I'm going to be talking about the elasticity of various variables with respect to distance from Milan, that should say. Okay? So in 1951, moving 10% further away from Milan reduced your market access by 5%. Okay? There are going to be elasticities like this floating around. So it's how fast. So that elasticity is a measure of the steepness of the gradient. And it was steepest in 1951. That date's going to recur. That's the elasticity measuring the slope of that thing. The R squared is possibly more interesting. An astonishing amount of the variance of a number of the variables we're going to look at is explained by distance from Milan. We counted for 84%. Okay, astonishing. Okay, there's some very aggregate facts. We're going to be making the case that particular sectors, booming sectors, were advantaged in North at various of these phases. So let me run quickly through these particular sectors. Agriculture, very quickly. 1881, that top blue line, pretty uniformly distributed. But obviously what happens through time, I should say what's on the vertical axis, it's the share of employment in agriculture in each region. As we go through time, it declines in all regions, obviously much more in the south. So a south-north gradient emerges, right? I mean, that's a positive gradient on there for agriculture. Manufacturing, obviously going the other way through time, the sector enlarging, but the north-south gradient getting larger. Or in terms of these elasticities, manufacturing, that negative gradient peaking round about there. I should say CI is census of industrial production, CP is population census, and let's not get into too much of a debate about those two things. So for manufacturing, that gradient. Textiles, really steep gradient throughout the whole period. But again, getting steeper. So as textiles collapse, they collapse in the south rather than the north. Okay? Engineering. As engineering grows, it grows basically entirely in the north. So these are just figures to display the north-south gradient and the accompanying elasticities to quantify and measure it across regions for different sectors through time. Doesn't apply to all sectors. Clothing, furniture, there are some where that gradient, where it's there in the numbers, but visually, obviously, much less. Okay. That set out some facts which we will refer back to. Those elasticities, if you can remember them, they're the slope of that north-south gradient. We will refer back to them. Let me do one slide on theory, and then try putting it together in the narrative for the periods. Theory. How does natural advantage affect things? The obvious, I'm not going to say anything about it. How do domestic market access, these sort of geography variables, affect things? Let me say a couple of words about that. Let's think of the simplest sort of geography model. It's not even a geography model. It's a new trade model circa 1970-something, really stripped-down version, which contains two sectors. One, think of it as agriculture, sort of perfectly competitive, small stuff. The other, monopolistically competitive, think of it as industry or manufacturers. Let's think of there being two regions, north-south, and let's have north larger than south, and also a rest of the world, because we want the foreign market access stuff. Okay. And then this picture just does a sort of basically a very simple thought experiment. So on the vertical, let's take output in north and south, manufacturing output, that should say, not total, manufacturing, rather importantly, on the vertical there. Okay? And in that beginning, north is 50% bigger and it's got 50% more manufacturing, fine, whatever. On the horizontal axis, there are trade barriers. So 1.5 is 50% tariff equivalent. Okay? Let's just very quickly do two thought experiments. If you close this economy, so moving to the right, increasing those barriers, what does that do to the distribution of that manufacturing activity between regions? Answer, it draws it into north and out of south. The way to think about that is south has got the smaller domestic market, as we saw in one of the, in the data, right? So when foreign market access gets more difficult, that's proportionately more of a problem for south than it is for north. Okay? So period of closure, other things being equal, will hit the region with the worse domestic market access harder. Okay? So south gets screwed. Right? Let's do a second experiment on the same figure. Suppose that you close the economy, we're out on the right-hand side of that diagram. Now let's open it again, but let's open it in a way that favours north, opening to the European community, whatever, right? So let's pull down trade barriers for both north and south, but faster for north. And then we're heading left on the diagram on the dotted lines. That benefits firms in both regions. They've got all this extra, better access to European markets. It benefits both. But it benefits firms in north more, obviously. But firms in north also sell in south, so the southern firms are really being squeezed by all this competition from the fact there are more northerners. So manufacturing output in south falls again. So south suffering both ways, north gaining both ways. Okay, I've given you some facts, aggregate facts, given you a very light bit of theory. Now let me try and talk through the narrative for those three periods that I set up in the outline. Okay, first period running through to sort of 1890-ish. And let's just run through our list of forces, foreign market access, domestic, natural advantage. Foreign market access, I believe it is the case from reading the work of many of the people in this room and talking to Brian, that in that early period, there was nearly free external trade after unification. And of course, it was largely maritime, so market access was as good for, as in foreign market access, for south as for north. And indeed, I think it's been argued by some people, possibly in this room, that it was better for south than for north. But basically, not that different. No great sort of regional pattern coming out of the foreign, no north-south differential coming out of that. What about domestic market access? Well, pretty fragmented, little market integration at that stage. So really, quite a lot of production was just for local markets. And looking back in the data, Campania was the second largest manufacturing district, or share of employment, after Lombardy in that early period. But again, the point is no great sort of north-south advantage there either way on the domestic access. But of course, first period we would argue it was natural advantage that was driving things. And I guess, above all, silk and textiles, silk in particular, a very high proportion of Italy's exports. And of course, silk is intensive in water, which benefited the north. And I think there are also a lot of other complementary factors to do with intensive land cultivation and distribution of population, which almost everyone in this room knows more about than I do, so I'll pass over that fairly quickly. So the story then, natural advantage in first period, fine. And of course it's there in some of the numbers I showed you earlier, these elasticities with respect to distance from Milan, the north-south gradients there, importantly. Let me go on to that middle period, perhaps more interesting, perhaps more controversial. And again, let me run through foreign market access, domestic, natural advantage stuff. There was progressive closure of the economy from 1890 onwards. Ingredients of that. One, policy. Again, people in this room know this. I put average tariff rates there, work of Federico and others. The average tariff rates increasing, the Franco-Italian trade war, selective tariffs on textiles, later on engineering, and obviously that going to some near closure in the fascist period. Closure also because of changes in the world environment, particularly towards the end of the period, depression and wars. The data on this, and this claim that sort of Italy was relatively closed, obviously doing a comparison with other countries is useful. So this measure the country's share of world trade relative to its share of GDP, and this is taken from Nico's work. In 1880, Italy was average. That share was 1, same share of trade as income. It dropped to 0.75 to 0.7 at a time when the equivalent numbers for France and Germany were increasing. So Italy appearing closed on that measure. But of course that measure is overall trade, it's exports plus imports. We really want to make the case that exports were much more closed than that appears because of remittances. If you look at this figure, exports were running at round about 10% of GNP. Remittances were running at round about 6% GNP. So basically, we would argue, there was a massive Dutch disease going on here. If you think of foreign exchange earnings through the current account were 60% larger than those goods exports. So real sort of closure due to migrants' remittances. Italy had exported people and the flow was coming the other way. One other thing I want you to note from that figure 8, well, a couple of things, let me emphasize. So total exports, increasing during the sort of era of great, first globalization, basically going flat, right? I mean, total foreign exchange earnings increasing because of remittances, but exports just flat, just dead until declining in the fascist period. Also, there's a little bit of sectoral detail here. So the red line there is engineering and metals, which certainly overtook textiles in employment share in the sort of late 20s or so, but nowhere near in the export share. So in the employment share, it overtook. In the export share, really lagging. So rather closed development of those new sectors. Foreign market access, domestic market access, sort of pulling the same way. Obviously, market integration, meaning that regional specialization within Italy was possible. Rising consumer demand, as people were having more discretionary spending over and above food expenditures. So, as domestic communications became easier, so that regional specialization became easier. And of course, natural advantage was still going on as well, but increasingly in the form of hydropower rather than irrigation, rather than water for growing things in this period. Okay, so the middle story then is one of closure. Think back to the theory. That's going to encourage inwards-looking, clustering developments. So you'd expect things to be more concentrated. At this point, you should be asking, well, why concentrated in north, not in south? After all, Napoli was the biggest city in 1920, so why the north? Well, I think our argument there would be, we've already seen domestic market access was biggest in north throughout the period. And of course, there were lots of other elements that mattered. Inter-industry linkages, thick input markets, labor skills, all the stuff that comes with the earlier development. And, well, I've shown you the numbers once. This is just reproducing some of them. So during this period, textiles certainly became more concentrated in north. That elasticity, that gradient became steeper. Engineering was growing fast. And, well, you've seen the picture, the thing getting a lot steeper. And so into the third period, and nearly there. And here, let me just talk about foreign market access, because I think it's clearly the sort of key dominating thing. Obviously, during this last period, tariff reductions, MFN reductions, but then also reductions within the EEC, the European integration process. Unsurprisingly, as you'd expect, the northern orientation of Italy's exports increasing dramatically, doubling the share to the original EEC members, doubling over that period. But one thing that really is which surprised me, really is worth noting, is that it wasn't until really late 60s, 1970 or so, that the export share in GDP regained the level of 1900. basically. So I suppose I was thinking in terms of opening to the north and export growth in 1950. It really wasn't. It was late 50s, 1960, where this really becomes quantitatively important. Okay, so that's the foreign market access story in that period. Implications, what does the theory say? Well, it says, if you remember that little theoretical example, it says opening to the north should lead to concentration of those sectors in the north, providing, of course, the north has got a comparative advantage let me say that right. Providing, of course, that the sectors that are in the north are those in which Italy has got a comparative advantage. So they're not going to be wiped out by import competition, they're actually growing exports out of the country. And of course that was the case. We've already seen it was engineering that was growing there. So engineering, white goods, all the elements of that Italian miracle of the 50s and 60s. So opening that's biased to the north will bring concentration. But of course, opening per se will bring deconcentration, just the reverse of the argument that I made for the previous period. So actually there are two things going on here. There's opening, which should deconcentrate clusters. There's opening to the north, which will benefit the north. If you look at the data, there is this turning point. So what we have here, the vertical axis are those elasticities from the two different data sources. So the slopes, it's a negative slope, right? So the negative slope is getting bigger until the 1950s, 1960s. So there are these two forces at work. It's opening, which should deconcentrate, but it's biased to the north. There are two forces at work, and an apparent turning point somewhere in the 50s and 60s, as we've seen with so many of the other variables here. Let me wrap up. Okay. The first bullet here is just the summary one. I've said it already. We think there's a story here of this interaction between external and internal geography, external trade and internal geography. How much of the story does it account for? We haven't done a quantification exercise. We're not saying 20% institutions, 80% trade, but we are trying to suggest there's a plausible narrative here, a plausible sequence of events and phases that give the pattern that's emerged. Italy is different from other countries. At the beginning I said something about rust belts in America or Britain as industry, as activity moved completely away from some areas. We also did a little bit of comparison with France and Spain, and really quite different patterns emerging. You look at France, and obviously the Paris region has always been dominant, and Lyon dominant, and the north was, but then you've got sort of Grenoble area and Toulouse area, just much, much more fluid throughout, and obviously much more geographically dispersed. And similarly Spain, the Basque region and the east of the country. Final comment. Obviously other things matter. Urban structures, which we talk about a little bit in the paper, but I haven't had time to say anything about here. Institutions and all that, which we could talk about at great length. But I do want to make a point, which I believe, which is that a lot of institutions are endogenous to trade. There is evidence, some weak selected, that exporting induces countries to improve their institutions. Successful exporting, being successful in exporting, interacting with foreigners, having to compete, whatever it is. We've got Acemoglu on the North Atlantic trade, whenever it was, some more recent development work from Roderick and others. So the argument that institutions are, at least to some extent, endogenous to trade. But of course, I think that leaves us with a very negative view of the South. In the South, at the moment, accounts for 10% of Italy's exports. Essentially, he's putting it too bluntly, but it's not interacting with foreigners. It's not under that sort of competitive pressure to export and upgrade institutions. So there's a sort of nasty story of a vicious circle that I think comes out of this, or might come out of it, were we to endogenize institutions as well as tell the trade and geography story. Thanks.
The discussant for this paper is Francesco Caselli from the LSE.
I really enjoy reading this paper for reasons I will explain. The paper is essentially about this picture, or largely about this picture, which plots the per capita income in the north and the per capita income of the south over time. The omitted region is Lazio here. And this picture is actually not in the paper, but it's done by me using data in table 1 of the paper. So this is the data of the paper. And it shows things that, broadly, qualitatively, we all know, obviously, that there's been divergence between the north and the south, and the paper is largely about this divergence. And the way the paper approaches this question is to look at Italian economic history through the lens of trade theory, particularly the part of trade theory that emphasizes the geography. Now, I should say I'm neither a historian nor a trade theorist, so this makes me uniquely unqualified to comment on this paper, and I think that will transpire quite clearly from my discussion. But I'll try to convey the main ideas of the paper nonetheless. So the paper identifies 3 sources of divergence. In the first, there is a first period, which is the 1860-1990 period. The idea is that the engine for growth is the exploitation of natural resource advantages, and in particular the industry that the authors highlight is silk. Between 1890 and 1950, the key driver of growth is the domestic market, because the country becomes increasingly isolated from the rest of the world, and trade barriers go up to the rest of the world. And therefore, the main sort of advantage for the point of view of growth is to be close to the domestic market, or to the largest part of the domestic market, and that's the north again. And finally, in the later period, this proximity to the EU market that determines which regions will be growing faster. And again, so all these 3 mechanisms favor the north, and so you have a sequence of advantages to the north that sort of create a narrative of progressive divergence. So my general reaction is that this is a great story. It has a lot of really interesting data in there, some very cool statistics. They come up with this idea of elasticities with respect to distance from Milan, which I never saw before, and it's a really beautiful way of capturing some of the evolutions of the geographical inequalities in Italy. Moreover, I should say that the paper is written with great flair, and it's really a pleasure to read because it orchestrates an interaction between economic insight and narrative with data, a continuous back and forth between data and narrative, which really makes it a pleasure to read. In the end, I'm very interested in the story. I think it's a very elegant, aesthetically very satisfying account of what may have happened, and I'm just left asking for more in 2 senses, I would say. One sense is that I would like to know more about, and this is the last point in Tony's presentation, about the likely quantitative importance of this mechanism. So I would have expected, or maybe I'm entitled to expect in the future, perhaps 3 different papers for the 3 different periods, each of which writes down, form a general equilibrium model, calibrates it, and tell us how big the effects can possibly be from this mechanism, and how much of the story can we explain. So I'm really looking for the formally calibrated model that will do that. And I think I think to really push forward this agenda, it's essential that is done. And then, of course, the paper is already replete with data, and it's very rich of data, but it's always, the hunger for data never ends, and so there are possibly more data things that can be done to buttress this story. Let me talk about the first period very briefly. I have very little to say about this, 1860, 1890. I mean, the first thing, which is kind of a bit basic, is to be clearer on the facts about income on this period. So it might not have escaped to you that the author's data, they actually start in 1890, so before this 1860, 1890 period, in terms of per capita income. This is per capita income data. My understanding is that there is actually a debate on whether there was divergence before 1890 or not, and I think the paper next in today's session is exactly about that. But I think it would be useful to know, is there really something to explain here in terms of divergence or not? Now, Sick makes a great story. As I said, can you do more to convince us that it is quantitatively important? This is a very cheap shot, but it's very easy to come up with alternative mechanisms that, at least prima facie, may seem potentially much more important. Personally, I think about the South in this period as a country under foreign military occupation. There is a repression, some say very brutal repression, guerrilla war. There is massive institutional and legal change. All the political institutions are changing. Property rights are redefined. This is like Iraq after the U.S. invasion. It's not clear that it's all that important, the distribution of natural advantage between different countries. Now, the 1890-1850 period, we are on firmer grounds in terms of per capita income. So this is the period of this big divergence, right? From the beginning here to this big here. This is the period, and this is clearly the key period that we need to understand to think about the divergence between North and South post-unification. Again, this is always data from Table 1 in the paper. So the story have a very elegant, very elegant interpretation of this period. They view the economy as largely a closed economy because of increased trade barriers with the rest of the world. So what really matters is the domestic market. So whatever you produce for the domestic market. The key theoretical ingredients are increasing returns in manufacturing and transportation costs. That creates a force for clustering of the manufacturing sector, the increasing return sector, and it will want to go where the mass of the population is. The mass of the population is in the north, and in fact, it should be actually population times per capita income, so the mass of the spending power, say, and that's in the north. And the paper, I think, presents very clear and very compelling evidence that this income divergence in this period is associated with differential speed of industrialization between the North and the South. I think that part of the paper is very convincing, and I certainly believe that it's very important to understand divergence in per capita income together with divergence in industrial structure, and particularly faster industrialization in the North. So I have only a couple of questions about this. One is, again, most likely due to my lack of understanding of the underlying theory. I would have thought that intuitively, yes, you want to be near the large population centers, but physical distance from the outer reaches of the countries would also play some role. You may want to trade off these two things. And so just pursuing the logic of this, trying to locate production optimally, given the both geographical and population distribution of the country, I would possibly have expected a more north-central location than the northwest corner up there, Lombardia and Piemonte. So I'm wondering if I'm just completely misguided in this intuition, or whether, or in other words, again, perhaps a more formal model with a spatial element to show that indeed you can get this clustering in a corner of this very, or actually at one end of this linear country would be actually quite useful in this case, because it doesn't completely fit with my intuition of how this geographical element matters. The other thing I would intuitively have expected, given the story that the authors tell, is a story where the productivity gap between manufacturing and agriculture grows faster in the north than in the south. You're assuming increasing returns in the north, in manufacturing. So as manufacturing increases, you get this productivity increase thanks to increasing returns. Now, how do you get in a model to get people to move out of agriculture into manufacturing? Well, you need the if the pull is coming from the demand side of the labor market, which is the story here, you want to see an increasing gap in manufacturing and agricultural wages in the north, and that gap opening up faster in the north than in the south. Okay, so it would be very good to see some data on relative wage gaps or productivity, or labor productivity gaps in manufacturing and agriculture, comparing north and south, and showing that the gap opens up faster in the north than in the south. Now, I didn't get quite the right data to do that, but I found this paper by Felice, which shows the labor productivity in agriculture. I'm taking labor productivity. I'm hoping that the wage will be somewhat proportional to labor productivity. Here, he breaks it down in northwest, which is the blue line, northeast and center, which is the red line, and south, which is the green line. What you see here is, in agriculture, you have massively faster growth in productivity in the north than in the south. Whereas in manufacturing, yes, there is some divergence. The blue line is somewhat stable in the relevant period. The relevant period is about this middle period here. Yeah, you have some falling back of the south, but I cannot make this statement too precise because I don't have quite the right data. But the impression from this picture is not entirely consistent with this view that the manufacturing agricultural gap is opening up faster in the north than in the south. It looks like manufacturing productivity is not diverging dramatically, whereas agricultural productivity is growing much faster in the north than in the south. So in that sense, it would be important to sort of double-check this stuff and see how we can make it consistent with the story. Let me just say, even within the framework that binds together the income differential with the differential industrialization process, there are obviously many alternative mechanisms that could do this. Just to, you could tell a bunch of stories where there is a disproportionate expansion in some inputs that is complementary with manufacturing in the north. So, say, capital market development. If capital markets develop faster in the north and manufacturing is more capital intensive, you could have a differential growth of manufacturing in the north. I put in red for reasons I'll show you later, but you could have differential declining cost of sectoral migration from agriculture to manufacturing. Say, public education, for example. Manufacturing is much more human capital intensive than agriculture, so if the cost of acquiring education falls faster in the north than in the south, as may be plausible, you're going to have that this manufacturing complementary input, which is human capital, grows faster in the north than in the south. That also will give you to this kind of simultaneous structural transformation and income divergence, and of course infrastructure. I think you can come up with various stories for why you could have the provision of this, the supply of these inputs growing differentially in north and south. One possible story could have to do with the fact that the state, to my understanding, which may be wrong, is that the state is still quite controlled by north and northwestern interests in particular in this period of time. Now, this alternative mechanism obviously will share with the mechanism in the paper the prediction of faster per capita income growth and industrialization in the north. But I think importantly, one of these, the one I highlighted in red at least, has very different predictions about the wage gap, the differential wage gap in manufacturing and agriculture. In particular, in this story, what's happening is that it's not a demand, it's not an increase in the relative demand for manufacturing workers that pulls workers out of agriculture. It's an increase in the supply of manufacturing workers through education, through public education. So that story actually would have the prediction that manufacturing and agricultural gaps shrink in the north compared to the south. And it would be potentially more consistent with the data I showed you. And I have a paper that sort of works that out. So that kind of mechanism, in the paper I mentioned there, that kind of mechanism is used to explain the very similar symmetric facts about the north and south of the US. And the structural transformation at different rates in the north and south of the US. Do we have any time left? No. Not really. Okay, so just one last point about the latest period. Again, it's not a glaring period of divergence. Again, these are the data of the authors. It's not a massive divergence, and so one question will be again clearer about what we are trying to explain. I think an important point is, again, these are the Felice data. If you put this in per worker terms instead of per capita terms, if actually don't see any divergence in this later period between north and south. That suggests that the main story here has something to do with labor force participation. Okay, conclusions is a very creative, very elegant, really, really elegant application of economic geography to economic history, really thought-provoking. It illustrates the richness and potential of the economic geography approach to tackle a wide variety of problems. But I think, either in this paper or more likely in future paper, more work on the empirical and quantitative bite of this mechanism would be actually very important to sort of convince people, I think.
Francesco, would you like us to collect some questions and then you respond, or would you respond immediately?
Maybe you should.
Okay, let's collect a few questions. Yeah, maybe short questions. Yeah.
Okay, I have 2 points. First point about silk. I am not very convinced that silk matters that much. I wrote that in a paper. Maybe I can give Brian, because it's Italian, so I will give Brian the reference. I cannot enter here in all the details, but I am a bit skeptical that silk can explain the difference. Second, and more important from my point of view comment, is that I think that your paper is very interesting, and I can buy your 3 stages differential, but provided you shift them by about 20 years each. So my point is that the first phase should finish around 1910 or maybe 1920. The second one would end up perhaps in the mid-1960s or late. Maybe we can go on and discuss, but if you want, I can argue my position, but this is my comment.
There's a question by Giorgio Caselli there.
I have a comment on the comments by Francesco, and that is your puzzle or is why there is no partition between, say, Northwest and Northeast in the analysis of the paper, which I haven't read really. A tentative, I don't know whether it has been treated by, I suppose, by the economic historians, is the tentative answer to that is the fact that for 2/3 of the period under consideration, the eastern part of the North was subject to war or the threat of war and invasions, up until, say, the Berlin Wall, if you like. And if you ask why the fleet was in La Spezia rather than Trieste, the answer is obvious. And why steel industry and shipyards, well, shipyards were also near Trieste, but really, I suppose you have to take into account military situations and the fact that France was certainly not a threat during that period, whereas the eastern side was, and also during the war, First World War, of course, the Veneto region was subject to maneuvers, if not war itself, and until recently, I suppose, there were military constraints on the use of land there. So I'm certainly not an expert in that, but I think it should be considered.
One more question here.
Table 2, a key stylized fact to the story is a puzzle to me, total table 2. You report there the elasticities of Milan to region J, and as I tell you, it's physical distance, which is constant over time. Yeah, right? So you're not pricing the cost of per mile, and so there's no railroad effects lowering transportation costs. There's no autostradas lowering the transportation costs. I would have thought that elasticity should decline over time, since we know those costs fell. And it doesn't, it rises. So it doesn't until after 1951 or 1950. So, and the text in your presentation, Tony, didn't offer any explanation of those bizarre trends. And since that's such a critical parameter to your tale, I wish you would.
Okay, let me add one little thing. I don't know if you're aware of it, but Riccardo Faini, in his PhD thesis, and I don't know whether he published that paper or not, was the proponent of the first paper that I ever saw on cumulative processes set in when increasing returns to scale are present, and he proposes this specifically to apply to the Italian north-south differentials. The thing which is missing, was missing at the time from his work, is the closure. I mean, essentially the international trade dimension, which is the specific point that you bring in. And the other remark I wanted to add is mobility of labor may have exacerbated these processes, especially after the Second World War. Essentially, the migration of labor from southern to northern Italy has kept wages low in the industrial north, and has conferred a further advantage in international competition to the industrial north in a way which is very similar to what is happening in China today. So you may want to think about these things. I don't know if there are any more questions, otherwise we should let the authors respond. One hopefully quick question.
Thank you. Yeah, very quick point. The policy implication of that paper are devastating, aren't they? I mean, so you have to wait for kind of a boom in Northern Africa to get a change in that pattern, or is that? I mean, would you? I mean, it's not definitely not the focus of your paper to talk about policy implications, but maybe you could just make some comment on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the ball is in your field.
I'll start. I take all of the criticisms and suggestions that were made on board. They all seem well taken to me. The only point on which I'd like to comment is this question that Jeff Williamson raised about physical distance versus transport costs. So arguably we should be using transport costs when we measure market access. But in these tables of elasticities with respect to distance, what we're looking for is simply a way of describing the pattern of economic activity as it varies across regions. So we could have opted for something like a tile index of the inequality of the distribution of manufacturing employment. You'll see that in a lot of other papers on economic geography. But we wanted something that would bring space into the picture. So that's the answer. I'm not sure I understand the point. It's simply a description of where manufacturing is. That's what is intended by this elasticity measure.
What I tried to do was give you a story as to why activity had moved around to make it move that way. Moved that way because of natural advantage, then domestic market advantage, then foreign stuff. Yeah. Can I come in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, I can't speak to silk and things at all. Let me just react to a couple of things, though. As you think through a sort of economic geography model, there are lots of bits that I didn't talk about and that we really didn't do rigorously or properly. One of them, I suppose, is hysteresis. Yeah, maybe Milan is where it is because it always was there, right? In that little theoretical example, that was a 1970s trade model. It didn't have all the cumulative causation, hysteresis sort of stuff that the new economic geography goes on about. So, getting a richer, doing more on that would be good, right? The wage side is also really important. And I think Brian persuaded me that, let me back up a bit. I mean, if whenever there was a pull for something in the north, towards the north, that immediately fed into wages, obviously you'd get smaller quantity changes and it would have fed into factor price changes instead. I think Brian persuaded me that for a long time there were pools of surplus labour in the agricultural regions in the north. So those wage relativities didn't move very much. But we need to do more on that. So both those 2 points really reinforce Francesco's first point, that rather than just having this sort of somewhere in the back of my head, actually having a proper model here would probably be rather good. So if there are any willing and able graduate students, I'd be grateful to know their existence.